Hi, I'm Erin McDowell, and welcome to this episode of Bake It Up a Notch. This is one of 3 episodes that we are doing this holiday season for me to share my 3 favorite gingerbread recipes with you. And today we are talking decorative gingerbread that I use to make gingerbread houses. Gingerbread houses are a big tradition in my family. My mom used to make houses for my brother and I and our friends growing up, and it was a big party celebration as we led into the holiday season. I'd like to carry that tradition on by throwing a similar party for kids in my neighborhood here in New Jersey, and I've had as many as 30 kids at my house, all decorating gingerbread houses, and it is such a blast. In this episode, I'm going to tell you everything you need to know about mixing up my favorite decorative gingerbread dough. We're going to show you about how to roll it out, cut out the pieces for houses, assemble the houses. We're even going to go to my favorite candy store in New York City where I shop every year for decorations for the houses. And of course, we're gonna invite some of my kid friends over because for me, the holidays are all about seeing it through the eyes of kids. It makes it so much more fun and so much more special. So we'll get some of my friends in here to help me decorate this gingerbread village we've created. It's gonna be a blast and I cannot wait to get started. If this sounds like something you'd be interested in, please be sure to click like and subscribe so that you can be joining us for every episode of Bake It Up a Notch that we have. With that said, let's get baking. You will never guess where I am right now. I'm a kid in a candy store. Some silver. Let's get some gold. Basket. I don't always have a plan. Like sometimes I have a color scheme, and I think this year I am gonna go for lots of red, white, metallics. So other than that little bit of a color scheme, we're just gonna go around and see what's good. And I'm gonna be like an actual kid in a candy store right now. But where do you even start? Ooh, okay, yeah, these. Ooh, wait. Oh, these were my favorite when I was a kid. These are not for gingerbread, these are just for me. This is gonna take forever. These are good. Oh, yes, licorice. This is harder than I thought. Oh, I got these last year too, and all the kids loved them because they're little, they're Brimleys. So we'll get all the kids some licorice Brimleys. Oh goodness. These are owls. Back to what we're actually gonna use. Oh my. Chocolate, we're not here for chocolate, stop. Ultra Slim Pocky. Who are you? This is research and development. This is getting to be a fun handful. Oh. Now we come to the wall of jelly beans. I know they're in there, I see you. Yes. Giving some kids some cavities for Christmas this year. Ham and kale flavored candy canes. Retire mints. I don't feel like pranking any of the kids this year, so I won't do that. Now it's time to go home, unpack our haul, and get decorating. Extra big thank you, as always, to Economy Candy for making this happen. Let's talk about the equipment because gingerbread houses can really be quite simple or they can be more complex and you can really bring in a lot of special tools. So I'm just gonna name some of the equipment that I'm using in this episode so that you know what I might be pulling out. We've got an electric mixer with the paddle attachment for mixing the dough. We've got small offset spatulas, piping tips in different shapes and sizes, a rolling pin. It's also especially great if you can use a rolling pin that has guides, like this Food 52 rolling pin, which is great because that way you can get a really even thickness for all of your pieces. You can make little templates for yourself. I just made some out of parchment paper and labeled them. My friends at Food 52 have actually made a gingerbread template. You can find it in the video description box below. I've got a pastry wheel. These are some more size guides, a paring knife. Underneath some of these tools, I have a cardboard sort of base. That's what I use to build the gingerbread houses on, and those are available at craft stores. And then over here, I have some spice jars from my cabinet. Sometimes I use clean jars like this to provide support as I'm building the house. So that's why I have these here. I just kind of use them as supports. You can use anything you have in your pantry for that. And then when we are talking about some extra special stuff, these are some little texture pieces that you can use to press in the dough to make textures like brick or wood grain. And one of the things that I always do to my gingerbread houses, because it makes them so extra special, is I like to add a little light feature onto the inside. So I've got some battery operated LED lights that we're gonna put right into the gingerbread house as we build it. This happens to have a little remote that comes with it, so I can put the whole thing inside the gingerbread house and just turn it on and off as I want. Of course, we're also gonna be using pastry bags along with our piping tips. But this is also a lot about using your mind, your creativity, and your hands. Let's talk about making the decorative gingerbread dough. Now, this is a little bit different than most of the gingerbread recipes that I make when I'm just planning to ice it and eat it delicious like cookies. In this case, there are some changes to the recipe, and they're really important. For one, you guys know how much I love butter, but I'm using shortening in this recipe because it helps to make for slightly sturdier gingerbread houses that are really gonna hold together better. They're gonna stay crisper for longer, all the things that we want to help keep that house sturdy. It also uses quite a lot of flour. This dough is really about making something that is going to bake up really, really crisp and stay where we put it and not, have any problems. So while I am putting some spices in it for flavor and to make my house smell amazing, you can absolutely eat this dough. I don't usually eat this gingerbread dough. I prefer to make my other gingerbread cookies that are a little bit chewier, more flavorful. However, you can always add more spices to this, kind of mix it up, and I do have instructions on Food 52 as well if you want to make this with butter. It does still work, and it'll make it taste a little bit better too. Okay, so to start, I'm just going to drop my room temperature shortening into my mixer fitted with a paddle attachment. And usually I actually do like to beat that for just a little bit, just to loosen it up a little before I add the sugar. Once you've loosened up that shortening just a little bit, you can go ahead and add the sugar. We want to cream that until it's nice and light and fluffy. Once you've creamed the mixture until it's nice and fluffy, we're gonna start adding the molasses. Now, it's going to be very likely that the dough is gonna want to split because we're adding a pretty decent quantity of liquid kind of into it. So don't worry if you see that. I'm gonna talk about how we could fix it if it does happen. But the key to preventing it is just to add it really slowly with the mixer running. I'm gonna go ahead and give this bowl a scrape because it's especially important that this is really uniformly combined before we continue. And of course, when you're adding something to the mixer while it's running, the likelihood for it to kind of splash up on the sides of the bowl is pretty high. So we just wanna make sure that we give it a good scrape. And in addition to scraping the sides and the paddle really well, we wanna get all the way down into the bottom because some of that shortening loves to just linger down there and not combine with anything. So we give it a good scrape, then we mix it some more. Okay, so once that molasses is nicely incorporated with the sugar and the shortening, it's time to add our eggs. We're just gonna add them one at a time. Gonna go ahead and crack them into a little bowl here. Go ahead, I just like to mix each egg in. Again, we're just trying to not throw off that ratio. We don't want anything to break in the process of mixing this dough. So we'll let that egg incorporate fully. We'll give it a scrape, then we'll add the next one. This is definitely a recipe where it's especially important. I talk about this a lot, but anytime that an ingredient is telling you it needs to be at room temperature, it really does. And in this recipe, if you're trying to use cold ingredients, you're gonna end up with a dough that looks super broken. At this stage, it might even look curdled almost. So really, really important to use room temperature ingredients here. All right, so now we're gonna start adding the flour. I am gonna have to do this a little bit gradually because it's a decent amount of flour. So Add it a little bit at a time, incorporate it just so you don't have a flour shower. A flour shower is when you put too much flour in the mixer and then you turn it on. See, look, I just spilled flour. I don't need to have a flour shower too. Okay, we'll mix this first. Perfect. Once that's incorporated, mostly incorporated at least, we can add a little more. And usually with the second addition, I go ahead and also add the spices, the ginger, the salt, and the baking soda. You can also whisk this into your dry ingredients and just kind of add them in batches, however you want to do it. As long as they get in there and nice and evenly incorporated. People don't realize this, but actually one of the hardest parts of my job is using a mixer backwards. That's why I get flour everywhere. When I'm upstairs, I don't do it, but it's hard. Flour shower. After all the flour is incorporated, I usually do something that you don't actually normally hear in baking recipes, which is I crank the speed up for just a couple of rotations. Normally, this would risk making the dough or batter a little bit tough, but in this case, I don't mind if it's a little bit tough. What I really wanna do is sort of force it to pick up everything that's on the sides. Now that it's all combined, it's going to do that a little more effectively at a higher speed. Just like that, that's perfect. Once the dough is all finished, it's really gonna be decently firm. It shouldn't be sticky to the touch. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna divide it into a few different pieces in preparation for rolling it out into gingerbread houses. Now, how many pieces you're gonna divide this into is kind of gonna depend on the size and shape that you're making. Sometimes I just divide it into 2 pieces and I cut multiple pieces of the house out of a larger piece of dough. Other times I might divide it into smaller pieces and actually use one for each component. It's completely up to you. It is a little bit easier to handle and manipulate smaller pieces of dough than larger pieces of dough. Okay. Once these are nice and wrapped, they're ready to refrigerate until they are firm. A few different things. It is really important to make these discs of dough just about 1 inch thick. If you make them too thick, it's going to be a lot harder to roll out your dough straight from the refrigerator. And this dough is a lot easier to roll out when it is a little bit cold. So I think about 1 inch thick, no thicker than 1 inch thick is kind of the magic number. So into the fridge until it's nice and firm. You can do this for a few hours, or you can do it, of course, a day ahead and chill it overnight. Once your dough has had a good amount of chill time, it is ready to be rolled out. And as you can see, this dough, even chilled, is soft. Like I can press an indent. It's not like staying super firm. So that's one of the reasons why it is a little bit easier to work with this dough when it is chilled. If at any stage it's getting warm or sticky while you're working with it, that is one of several reasons why we roll this dough out between 2 pieces of parchment paper. By rolling it out between 2 pieces of parchment paper, if at any stage during the process, whether it's the rolling, the cutting the fine shapes, removing the scraps, anything, you can just put another piece of parchment on top of it, slide it onto a baking sheet, and toss it in the refrigerator or even the freezer for a little time to firm up. So it kind of makes this little packet that makes it a little bit easier to move it around. The other reason we roll it out between 2 pieces of parchment paper is it allows us to use only as much flour as we need. While it's not necessarily a bad thing to use a lot of flour in rolling out gingerbread dough, because in some cases you might not even be eating the gingerbread dough for houses, so we're not necessarily worried about it being tough or unpleasant in any way. The main reason that we don't want to put too much flour is it can actually leave a visible kind of film on the surface. In fact, I can show you what that looks like. right here. I noticed that this one has it. So this is just some flour that was on this piece of gingerbread before we baked, and after baking, it's still showing up. So by using as little flour as possible, we are hopefully gonna maintain a more even kind of tone on the piece of gingerbread. The final reason that we roll this dough out between two pieces of parchment paper is that when you are cutting really detailed shapes for houses, the last thing that you wanna do is then try to slide a spatula underneath that and delicately move it to another tray to bake. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna roll it out. We're gonna cut our piece out right here on the parchment paper. Then we can slide that parchment paper onto a baking sheet and it's ready to bake, and it's gonna maintain its shape a lot easier than if we try to manipulate it. So let's go ahead and start rolling this dough out. I am gonna use just a tiny bit of flour in the early stages. I apply it to both sides and kind of rub it in. And then we're just gonna put our other piece of parchment on top. I don't always use rolling pins with these guides because I'm a pretty even roller outer after all of my pie practice and all of these years of making gingerbread houses. But with gingerbread houses, this is an especially good time to use them because if your pieces are uneven, they're gonna be a lot more prone to breaking. So keeping an even thickness is especially important to kind of maintaining the integrity of your final house. The other thing that I do love about the guides in this case, it does make the rolling go a little faster because I'm not questioning it. I'm not questioning if the thickness is even. And when you're making multiple houses, like when I do my gingerbread house party for kids usually, the last one I did in 2019, we had 30 kids and I made 30 small gingerbread houses. So that's a lot of rolling out to do. And these guides really make it a lot quicker of a process. So it's definitely a great time to bring those out. Now, every now and then, as you're rolling out your dough, you can kind of pull the parchment back. The dough is going to adhere to the parchment paper, and so sometimes I find that it kind of stops continuing to roll out, like it's almost like it's stuck. And it's just because in some cases it gets kind of attached to the parchment paper. You can even see it in our overhead shot here. The parchment will kind of change color as I pull it away. You can see how attached it is to the dough. So, and in this case, some of the dough even, we got a little bit of roughness. So I'm gonna use a little more flour and we'll keep going. In this case, I am using the 1/4 inch thick guides that come with this rolling pin. And that's a good point to bring up the thickness because I do typically roll out gingerbread for houses a little bit thicker than I would for cookies. The reason is, again, just sturdiness. I don't want them to be so thick that they're heavy and clumsy, but I also don't want them to be so thin that they break and crack really easily whenever they're touched. So a 1/4 inch or even a 1/3 of an inch, which sounds a little bit thick, is really, really good for dough for houses. I think we're there. Okay. Now see, I did have to use a little flour, so one of the things I can do is I can even brush that flour away now, just with my fingers, because it's easy to brush it off of dough before it's baked. It's not as easy to get it off of the dough after it's baked. I usually create new templates for my gingerbread houses every year. One year I did a gingerbread house inspired by Amanda Hesser's brownstone that Food 52, it started right in her house. And so I made a little brownstone version out of gingerbread. It was so much fun. I love that gingerbread house. And I've made all kinds of different shapes through the years. I've even made a gingerbread flat iron building, which was one of the more elaborate ones that I did. So making the templates and making them a little bit different each year is part of the creative and the fun for me. Just remember when you're using a template that you printed off, or if you've even written on it with any kind of ink, that the ink side is facing up and the plain paper is facing down. We don't want any ink touching our food. Once you've got it rolled out to the right size, it is time to cut. And I'm just gonna use the tip of a very sharp paring knife to cut around. Now, sometimes people actually use cookie cutters for this too. There are some brands that make cookie cutter that you can just use every single year. I do find that those are usually a little bit smaller. They're not as large of houses. And I don't know, I really like to make different sizes of houses, just like, you know, when you went to a neighborhood in real life, all the houses would be a little bit different. I like our gingerbread village to be the same way. When I cut, I always cut the line a little bit farther than the end of where the template is. The reason I do this is it makes the sharpest kind of corners. So you don't want to just cut, like see here, how I cut a little beyond that. That way, when I cut this section, I've maintained the sharpest corner. That's a really fine detail that you can really see only when you look super, super close, but it makes a big difference in the long run. Okay, another thing that I can do in this case, if I want to, this particular printout that I had even had windows drawn on it. So one of the things that I can do is I can just use a little tool, like this is my little cake testing tool, and I can just kind of trace around the windows and making kind of an impression on the dough. That way they're even and I know where to cut them. Of course, you can always freehand this and just skip this step entirely. It's just something that I kind of like to do to help myself keep it as even as possible. And then we'll just lift it up and see, you can actually see where those little divots that I made are so that I can cut out my little windows. Before I cut any of those windows or anything out, I'm just gonna go ahead and remove the scrap pieces of the dough around the outer frame of my house. Now, the other thing I want to point out that is really important about this gingerbread dough, you can re-roll this dough as many times as you want. However, because of the high quantity of molasses in this dough, it's gonna start to change colors as you roll it out over and over again. It will kind of start to oxidize and it's just gonna become a darker brown color. It won't affect the color in the final bake, but I just bring it up because I have actually had people ask me before, like maybe they think they can't keep rolling it out because the dough has changed color. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just something that does happen when you're using a higher ratio of molasses like this. Now, sometimes I go back through with my paring knife and just kind of cut right down the edge and then use the knife to just flick any of those extra pieces away. This is just to make as sharp of edges as possible. If I ever get to build my own house in real life someday, I'm gonna tell the architect, the vibe we're going for is gingerbread, okay? I want a real life gingerbread house. That's what I want. Okay, I'm gonna start cutting out my little windows. Now you can cut windows and things like that however you want. The one thing to be aware of is whenever you put them too close, you've created a really weak spot in the center of your piece of dough. So just something to consider when you're coming up with those designs. Another thing is if you're a beginning gingerbread baker and this really scares you, completely understand. I don't want you to be scared. You can just skip this entirely. You can roll out other pieces of dough and cut out little windows and do them almost like a 3D effect on a solid piece of dough. Really anything goes with this. So both of those can look really, really wonderful. And it's just a matter of kind of personal preference and your own comfort level because this should be really fun. So if cutting out lots of windows like this is causing you stress and anxiety, then perhaps it's time to do it a different way. And if your template doesn't have little windows and things on it already for you to follow as a guide, that's totally fine. Instead, what you can do is cut yourself a little template specifically for the windows. And in this case, I'm using some different window shapes because I think it's fun. I'm using kind of some arched, bigger windows below and then kind of this circle window up top, just to make this house look a little bit different. With the tip of the paring knife, I'm now gonna go in and pick up the excess dough from the inside. It should come out pretty easily and without any issue. If it does pose a problem, it's probably because the dough is a little bit too warm, and the best thing to do is going to be just to chill it before you try to remove that piece. Now, one other thing I want to talk about before we move on to bake this piece is some decorative elements that you can do before baking. Now, most of the decorative elements for gingerbread houses happen after it bakes. We put all that icing on it, we put all that candy on it, we have ourselves a blast. But sometimes there are certain elements that really look great baked onto the house. And one of those for me are kind of little window ledges. I think it just adds a lot of depth to the design. And so one of the ways I do it, like in this case, since we cut out the windows, I can just cut a little window ledge from the bottom portion so that it's the exact right size. And I'm just freehanding this, eyeballing it. It doesn't need to be perfect at all. And then I'm just gonna lift this section up. And then what we can do is we can lift up this little window ledge and just place it right down below here. And what you're gonna wanna do is use the tip of your paring knife to just kind of like mash the two pieces of dough together, just a little bit, just enough that you know that they're kind of adhered. On some of my pieces that I already baked, the window ledges kind of curved a little bit in the oven. It's like the coolest thing. They just kind of were like, and at first I was upset because I'd made these beautiful straight window ledges, but it actually made them look so fairy tale-y, so cottagey. It's really actually now one of my favorite parts about the gingerbread houses. So this is a very, credit to Bob Ross here. This is a very happy accident kind of scenario. You're gonna, no matter what you do, it's gonna smell really good and you're gonna be able to make a really cute little house. So even when something happens and it isn't that same perfect look anymore, just don't worry about it because it's still gonna be so adorable, especially when it's covered in frosting and candy. Now, another thing that I think is underrated with gingerbread that is a decorative effect that you can do before baking is applying texture of some sort. So one really simple way that you can do that, like with these window ledges, is just using the back of a paring knife. We can kind of press the dough down and make little ridges. And again, it just adds this like element, this extra element of depth and texture, which I really love. Another thing you can do are use those little plates that we talked about in the equipment section. You can press those right in and create effects like wood grain and bricks. Actually, why don't I just show you what that looks like? Gonna give us the cleanest press. And then we can just go right up in here on our dough, press really firmly on everywhere that it's touching the dough. And then when we lift it up, I literally just did this yesterday and it still actually delights me that much. I'm like, we made that. That's so cool. Okay, let's do it again. You want to press firmly enough that you have a nice, good line, but you also don't want to press so firmly that the dough like comes out. And you can get little presses like this at most craft and baking supply stores. What's so neat about effects like this, like adding texture, is it's actually very little extra effort, but after baking, it looks like $1,000,000. In some of the crevices, the dough might be a slightly different color. It really makes it look just like a different element of real. It brings things to life. So that's another really cool thing that you can do before baking to make your gingerbread look extra special. Now, before baking, we wanna make sure we give this a nice, good chill, just to keep everything as straight as possible. One thing that I wanna remind people is that if you do have an error, if like this circle, for example, kind of closes in, remember that cookie dough is actually really malleable while it's still warm. So you can even go in with a cookie cutter or the tip of your paring knife and kind of fix little problems in the early stages of baking. I just want to give people that confidence that if you see something going wrong in the oven, not all is lost. I also want you to be careful if you do try to manipulate anything like that while it is still warm, because of course you're dealing with a hot pan and a hot cookie. But really, this dough is so much easier to manipulate in a lot of ways than you might think. Let's get this chilling. See, this is what's so cool about this. We don't have to like freak out about this at all. We can just slide our whole piece right onto a baking sheet. How cool is that? No more freaking out. Okay, into the fridge it goes. In front of me, I have some pieces for a different style of house that I already baked. And I just wanted to kind of show, you can see a great variance in the color here between kind of some lighter gingerbread color, something a little bit more in the middle, and this really dark. This is what I'm talking about when I say sometimes I overbake the gingerbread. I like when it gets that really dark, beautiful color, and it makes it really, really sturdy, even with like a hole, like a window inside of it. So That's one of the reasons why I do it. This is still plenty firm and crisp. So this kind of comes down a little bit to the look that you're going for the style of the bake. And of course, I'm not super intense about the colors all matching either. But that's one thing that I think is really, really important to point out, is that in my gingerbread recipe on Food 52, there isn't actually a time listed, because the exact bake time is going to vary drastically based on what the size and shape of your pieces are. So it's really, really important to kind of learn the visual cue. And the main thing is that you want to see darker around the edges. Even if you're maintaining a lighter color in the center, you want to see something visibly darker around the edges. That's a good indicator that it is fully baked. Remember, when the cookie is still warm, it might be a little bit malleable, so handle it very carefully, and be sure to let your pieces cool completely before you attempt any kind of decorating, any kind of assembling, anything like that. So let's talk about royal icing. Royal icing is the sugary cement, the glue that holds these houses together. Of course, it's delicious. It's made with egg whites or meringue powder and powdered sugar plus water. For constructing gingerbread houses, we actually like a fluffier, lighter, thicker royal icing. So you want to make it on the thicker side, and it really should look almost as fluffy as a buttercream in some ways when you're done mixing it. It'll be really, really nice and fluffy. For more about royal icing, you're gonna wanna check out our bite-sized episode that talks all about how to make it, how to use it. Today, we're gonna be using a nice thickness. Also, a thicker royal icing is a little bit easier for kids and younger hands to work with, because when it's really, really thin, it just likes to fall right out of the pastry bag, right out of the piping tip. That's a little bit easier for someone who's a little more dexterous, like an adult, but for kids, it's nice to keep it a little bit thicker so that it's not really gonna go anywhere, even if they're holding the bag incorrectly. One of the last things that we have to talk about before we start building our house is if you wanna consider decorating your house before or after assembly. I know a lot of great bakers who like to decorate their gingerbread houses before assembling them. They lay the pieces flat like this, they bring in their pastry bags and they put in all the intricate detail, and they lay the candy and all of these things. That's one way to do it, and it is really wonderful. I find that since the assembly is a little bit trickier, that you can really risk messing up some of those beautiful decorations that you did. Also, since the assembly is trickier, sometimes when you go to assemble, I find that I almost need to put decorations somewhere because the house doesn't look as good there. So if you decorate it all separately and then you have to add stuff afterwards, it may just not work out. It's my personal preference to assemble the house and then decorate it. This also works great for kids because you can do it ahead of time, let them sit overnight, get nice and sturdy, let that royal icing dry out, and then they're ready to decorate. However, there are a few decorations that I love to do before assembling, just because they're a little bit more difficult to do after. So one of those is adding some window glass. Some people use hard candy for this. They melt it down until it's liquid, and then they just pour it in kind of level, and it makes this nice flat glass window pane. That is a really fun way to do it, and you can use lots of fun colors if you do it that way. When I was in pastry school, I learned about one of the most easy and beautiful ingredients that you can use for glass windows, and I'll never stop now because they just look like $1 million. They look like windows. This is an ingredient called leaf gelatin or sheet gelatin. I learned about using this in professional bakeries, but also sheet gelatin like this is used a lot in Europe and other places in the world. Here in the States, we typically use powdered gelatin a little bit more. But this sheet gelatin has this beautiful, first of all, it's beautifully clear, just like glass, and it has this beautiful pattern on it. You can buy this online, you can buy it in baking supply stores. It's actually not a terribly difficult ingredient to find, and it has a really long shelf life. So if you build gingerbread houses every year like I do, you can buy yourself a box and have your windows ready. You can look right through it. Hey, Faki. Hey, Tim. Okay, so I like to put those on before we assemble. Just gonna cut an opening from my pastry bag, and you can kind of take a piece of sheet gelatin You wanna have it be bigger than the window because we're gonna kind of attach it on all sides of the window, but we can trim it. It doesn't need to be the full piece. Just trimming it with scissors. And then you can apply the icing either to the gelatin or to the gingerbread, but I find it's a little bit easier just to add it to the outer edge of the gelatin. And I'm applying it to the interior of the gingerbread. That way we're not gonna see that icing. So I'm just gonna press it really firmly, especially in the corners. And then we'll need to let this dry, but you can see, howdy neighbor, welcome to my gingerbread house. Whenever you add something like this before assembling the house, you are gonna wanna let it dry out thoroughly before you assemble it, especially if the decoration is anywhere that you're going to need to be touching to build the house. In general, the rule with these houses is patience is key. This is a little bit easier in the winter depending on where you live because it's typically really dry. Royal icing likes it when it's dry. When you're dealing with humidity, it may take longer for the icing to dry, so just be patient. All right, so once all of your decorations, anything you've put on kind of separately has had a chance to set, you are ready to build. It's really important, in my opinion, to assemble the gingerbread house, if at all possible, a full day before you want to decorate it. Especially the way that I decorate it. I go all in on the candy, guys. I go heavy candy. And in order for this to support all that heavy candy, it's really going to need a chance for that icing to set and dry fully. Again, in the dead of winter, this really might only take a couple of hours. So you could always assemble your houses in the morning and have some gingerbread decorating fun by the evening. But I usually, when I'm doing it for these, the kids in the neighborhood, when I do this gingerbread house party, I assemble them a day, sometimes even 2 days ahead, and I get them all ready and set out with all the candy. That way when the kids come over, they're ready to decorate. So I think that the assembly really scares a lot of people for a lot of reasons. And I just want to say that one thing is that the house walls really support each other. The hardest part of assembly is the very first moments when we put the first 2 pieces down. But then once we get all those 4 bases there, they really do a wonderful job of supporting each other. So I just wanted to give you that little pep talk before we start, that it really is a lot easier once it has the support of its other walls, just like a real house. So I usually start with one of the kind of more front pieces of the house. The first thing I'm gonna do is just pipe along the bottom because that's the main place that we're gonna attach this to the board. In general, I wanna advise you to be decently generous anywhere that the gingerbread is touching the board or touching another piece of gingerbread directly. In kind of the nooks and crannies, you don't wanna be too crazy generous only because you're gonna see all that icing. Like it's gonna come out on the front, you might have evidence of it. So one of the best things to do is just like really use as much as you need, but only as much as you need. Otherwise you may risk kind of having a lot of more visible icing than you want even. After I place it down, I do usually kind of reinforce it with another layer of icing right on the board. So just making sure that there's enough icing all around there to really be encasing it. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is pipe along the edge where we're going to attach the next piece. And I'm going to take the next piece. Oh, well here, let me show you this. I'm balancing this one the whole time, but that's why we have these supports here, right? Is so that if we need to, we can just use these jars to keep that in place while we pipe onto our next piece. The other reason that we're being generous for the most part is that we also want to fill in anywhere where our piece isn't totally flat. I can kind of notice that my bottom, the base of this piece is a little bit curved. There's nothing wrong with that. It's still gonna work because the royal icing is really gonna act almost like grout. It's gonna fill in all those nooks and crannies. So already when we have this second piece in, I can take this support away and that house, the second wall is really supporting the first one. Now I want to apply a little reinforcement from the inside here because we're not going to see that anyway. So I want to apply a little reinforcement right on the inside with my pastry bag, right along where those two pieces meet. And you can give a little reinforcement along the back of that main piece too, just like we did the first. Now we're just gonna continue basically repeating that process with our other front piece and then our final side piece. And you really wanna make sure that they are pressed firmly together because that's how they support each other the best, is if they're really actually touching. You know, with plenty of icing, but that they're touching too. All right, I'm gonna do another reinforcement from the back here. And then we're going to put our final piece on. Okay. I've got lots of reinforcements in there everywhere that I think is appropriate. So now, I usually like to let this set for a while before I put the roof on. But the other thing that we can do is go ahead and put our little battery operated lights in. So I like to do this before we put the roof on for obvious reasons. It has a little battery pack. I just kind of put that all the way gently towards the bottom. Then I just sort of pile the lights on top, gives them a little volume, but that way those lights are really peeking right through the windows. And in this case, you may not be able to see yet until, it's gonna be cool. Gonna be very cool. Okay, perfect. So now what I wanna do is I wanna let this set for a little while. If you're going to leave the area and walk away from this, which is completely fine to do if you're a fearless baker like myself, but you can just go ahead and bring your supports back in on the outside edge so that if anything was tempted to fall outward, that it's got a little bit of support while it sets. And we're gonna let this set for a few hours. You don't need to let this set all the way till overnight. We just wanna give it a good base so that when we add the roof, sort of the base structure is set enough that we really only have to worry about that top part. So we'll give it a few minutes and we'll come back and roof it up. I let this house set while we ate our lunch, and now I think it's dry enough that I can go ahead and build the roof. Again, you don't have to let this set for too long, just long enough that that little sugary cement has had a chance to dry a bit. The roof can be more complex or very easy depending on the shape of your house. Typically, I like to do these sort of triangular roofs where you cut two pieces and they just meet on either side of the house. But sometimes, like on the top of the brownstone gingerbread house I actually just did one large flat roof, and that's another really easy way to go as well. The roof, unlike the sides, often needs a little bit of assistance from you to support it while it sets. So that's the one thing I'm definitely gonna be bringing in, maybe some of my helpers here. I might have to stand here and hold it with my hands for a little while it sets. That's just sort of the name of the roof game. So I'm gonna go ahead and start by piping where it's going to touch kind of these side awnings. Depending on the design that you're using, it may or may not touch your wall. So you kind of just have to know whether you can always put some frosting there kind of just to be safe in case it does make contact there. And then you're just gonna kind of press it down and hold it. We're gonna hold it just with our hands for a few moments before we try to add the second piece. And this is where Josh will like come up with something really clever to like speed it up and make it funny. Now this roof piece is not totally stable yet, so I'm gonna hold it in place with my hand while I rotate because I wanna be able to access the other side a little bit. Putting a good amount of icing up on the top. I'm reinforcing on the sides where it's touching. And now, we wait, just for a little bit. One Christmas medley later. Once you have your roof on and you feel like it's secure enough that you can take your hands away, just remember it is going to be a little bit precarious until that icing has had a chance to set. And I know that sometimes it makes me feel more comfortable to walk away from it if I use some little supports to prop it up. You can just use these jars. The only thing is you might have to find some way to prop them up. I use some lids from some storage containers here in the kitchen. You can just prop them up a little bit that way to help support the roof. In this case, this roof is looking pretty stable. I'm not going to add any supports, plus it's gonna be right here with me as I continue to film this episode of Bake It Up a Notch, so I'll be able to keep an eye on it. But if you're assembling your houses and you wanna be able to like kind of move on, that's a nice little bit of security you can give yourself until that icing is set. Now, in this case, I'm gonna let this icing set for several hours. You can definitely build it the day ahead, you can build it the night before, and then it's going to be ready once it's set to decorate. Just like with all big baking projects, with gingerbread houses, mistakes can definitely happen. So I want to talk about some of the mistakes because a lot of them are preventable and others actually are fixable. The first we already kind of went over, which is the under baking of the gingerbread. I went ahead and baked, this is an extra piece of a gingerbread roof, and you can see when I snap it, it really snaps. It's like it breaks almost cleanly because it's in this kind of very crisp, it's nice and baked. That is kind of what we're looking for gingerbread house pieces. We want them really, really crisp. When we underbake it, we end up getting this ability, this is just a cookie cutter that I did, but you get this ability for it to bend. That is not ideal because then when you're trying to build something, it might start to bend, cave in. When you start applying candy and things to it, it could start to weigh down, it could sort of fold. So proper baking is really important to kind of the structural integrity of your house. Be sure to bake enough. Save the underbaking for the chewy gingerbread cookies that you can get in my bite-size episode, because those are really wonderful, chewy, soft, love to see it. But with gingerbread, for decorating like this, we want it crisp, we want it really crunchy, we want it nice and brown. This same problem that I'm pointing to with the baking can also happen if you live in a humid environment. Even if you bake your gingerbread really, really crisp, if you're living in a place that has a lot of humidity or you're experiencing a lot of moisture in the environment where you are working with the gingerbread may start to absorb moisture from the air and soften with time. This is important if you are making your components ahead of time. You may want to re-crisp them before you build, refresh it, and be sure to take it again extra far so you have it as crisp and you've taken as much moisture out of it as possible. The other mistake that I always like to talk about is what happens if one of my pieces cracks? What if it breaks just like this and I don't have time to make another piece? I don't want to make another piece. Welcome to the wondrousness that is royal icing. It really is sugary cement. So right here on this house, which we assembled yesterday, we actually had a huge crack in our roof. The roof broke clean in half. We patched the roof with royal icing and let that set until firm. Once it was fully set, we put it on and this house is perfectly assembled and sturdy and staying just where it is. And because we're gonna cover this up with yummy decorations, no one is even gonna know that there was ever a crack there. In fact, on my gingerbread brownstone that I did for Food 52 several years ago, I absolutely panicked the day that we were shooting it because I had a big crack on the front piece. And you can see when I'm assembling it that I patched it, I put it back together, and by the time I was done decorating it, you never even saw where that crack and that patch was. So I wanna make sure that if you have something like this, don't collapse into a ball of baker tears. It's totally going to be fine. You can patch it, you can save it. And if you're feeling unsure, you can always bake a couple extra pieces for yourself so that if this happens, you're not in that kind of panic mode. Beautiful.
We're gonna start by putting one of these right there, and just put one in.
He's a pro. He knows just how to do this. This is what happens when you go to a gingerbread house party every year, right? But you said you've done this before, right? Are you a pro?
100 times.
100 times? That might be more than me. Let's be
Right.
real. You came for the frosting.
I came for the candy.
I came for the candy with a side of frosting. Look, should we put a little frosting on this? Look. Hi. Look at this. Oh, do you eat that one? Go ahead. I clean up the sprinkles, but your mom has to ride in a car with you after you've eaten all of the sugar, so it evens out. Roman, do I have any frosting on my face? Do I? I don't think I do. What about now? No? Well. How about now? What if I have a beard? It's good enough for Jasper. I think my favorite part is the roof, but I also love the gate that you did.
Yeah. My favorite part has to be the snow.
I think the snow looks amazing.
I don't know, our frosty kind of drooped, but...
Oh no, our snowman melted.
I'll just eat the gumball. I'll just eat the gumball.
And that is a glass half full outlook right there. I'm feeling it. But now I have to show you the coolest thing, which is I put lights in it when I built it. So we're gonna turn off the lights and I'll show you.
See them actually.
Are you ready?
1, 2, 3.
It looks so good. Go. They're beautiful. You see that? There's lights inside.
That looks so cool.
Woo! It makes it look even fancier than it already did. 9 years of gingerbread house experience, and you are officially a professional. And you're welcome. And we leave. Together.
We could do a montage.
A montage?
Imagine.
Trust me, when you see the final video, there's gonna be a montage. Thank you so much for joining me for this especially fun episode of Bake It Up a Notch, where we talked about decorative gingerbread for making gingerbread houses. I had so much fun having all my friends from the neighborhood come over and help me decorate these beautiful houses. And of course, as always, the recipe for this gingerbread and the icing that we used is in the video description below, and you can find all the recipes on food52.com. If you like this video, be sure to click like and subscribe so that you can be made aware of all of our episodes as they become available. And as always, I'm wishing you happy holidays and happy baking.